Thank you all so much for joining us for our first panel of Stalking Awareness Month. My name's Lauren. I'm the managing director of the nonprofit Stop Stalking Us. Lily Baldwin and I started this organization because people impacted by stalking do not have adequate support, whether that's from law enforcement, the justice system, their immediate circles, their workplace, tech companies, the list goes on. And it needs to change. And it's horrifying how many millions of people are impacted by stalking. But we also know that with those numbers, we can come together to make real change. Stop Stalking Us wants to tell people's stories safely and anonymously. We want to tell as many different stories as possible about people with a wide range of lived experiences and backgrounds. We know that telling our stories can be healing for us and for others, and that these stories can change the conversation about stalking and have a ripple effect that's bigger than any one person. So if you're interested in sharing your own experience, you can do so on our website, which we'll drop into the comments. We'll also include our email address if you prefer that. There's also a long list of resources on our website that can hopefully offer some guidance, whether you are the target of a stalker and you need help figuring out where to start, or you know someone who's facing this, or you just want to better secure your digital safety. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our guest for today. We're extremely lucky to have Dr. Patrick Brady, who's a criminologist, professor at the University of Northern Colorado and stalking expert. And today's conversation will be led by the lovely Jasmine Amjad, senior producer at Now This News. So I will turn it over to you, Jasmine.
Great. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm so excited to start this year with this conversation, a topic that I'm really interested about. And I'm excited to hear Dr. Patrick Brady's input and his research and everything all about it. Patrick, I don't know if you want to say anything before we get started.
Hello and Happy New Year. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for setting up an opportunity like this, because I think just having these conversations is so important.
Yeah, it's so important, especially after talking to Lauren about everything of why they started it. I'm like, this is so incredibly important. But yeah, I think we can get started.
All right, sounds good.
And I just want to know, I think right from the jump is, can you first tell us how you would define what stalking is and how your definition might be different from legally what it is defined as, and how that might vary from state to state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and actually, I've been doing a lot more research on this more recently in terms of trying to figure out what people generally perceive stalking to be. And so I generally describe it kind of in two ways. The first, it will be the behavioral, and then the second is kind of more the legal approach. And the good news is that there's a lot of overlap with it. The behavioral is more for everyday people, but also crime victim advocates who may be working with a victim of stalking who doesn't necessarily recognize that they're being stalked, or they may be being stalked but not recognize it as stalking. And so generally we define it as, actually sometimes it's easier to explain how it's different than pretty much every other crime. So especially from a legal perspective, most crimes like theft or burglary, those can result in an arrest and prosecution for an isolated incident, right? It's an offender's behavior that one act can violate that law. Whereas what makes stalking different is it actually requires a pattern of behavior. And so this can be really challenging for the legal system, because instead of having evidence of one kind of horrific event, they need kind of a pattern of evidence that shows that the offender's actions, one, don't serve a legitimate purpose. So it can't be things for protests or all the other myriad of reasons that offenders use to justify why they're in a neighborhood that they don't live in. And so it's a pattern of behavior that either causes someone to experience substantial emotional distress. And that's a relatively broad term. And even a lot of legal statutes don't necessarily define what emotional distress is, but essentially it's behaviors that are really disrupting someone's personal and professional quality of life. It makes it much more difficult to go on about their day, because honestly, like, victims do not feel safe, and they don't know what I think one of the biggest fears of victims is they have a fear of not knowing what's going to happen next. And so that can have a lot of implications in terms of how people live their lives. And so when you're in this constant state of like fear, or is he going to show up in my job and try to get me fired, that creates a lot of emotional distress. Emotional distress can also come from financial issues. So victims that are putting money into protecting themselves, purchasing a weapon, getting a stun gun, increasing, lighting, all that stuff. Like, these are expenses that the victim didn't ask for, and didn't necessarily budget in. And so it's creating a lot more issues where it just becomes so frustrating because victims are trying to do everything that they can, but do not have control over this person who is trying to basically invade their lives. So it is substantial emotional distress and or fear, so actual fear. And that is a point of contention that, like, one that we call it the fear standard, and that's really what separates kind of stalking from harassment. Harassment can also involve like a single incident, whereas stalking involves that pattern of behavior. Harassment can also involve that pattern of behavior, but really, like, harassment is more like, I'm annoyed, I'm frustrated, I'm not necessarily fearing for my safety. And that's what makes it stalking, where it's like, oh, wow, this person is becoming relentless to the point that I am not only concerned for my safety, but the safety of others, whether it's their children or new significant others or family members or people that they work with, or their friends and things like that. And so that's kind of the behavioral definition: a repeated course of conduct that either causes a victim to feel actual fear or experiences substantial emotional distress. And then, so from the legal standpoint, it really just puts a little bit more specific factors in that. So in terms of the pattern of behavior, most statutes in the United States define that as two or more different behaviors, or a single behavior that's perpetrated more than once. So that could be like repetitive texting. And if it gets to the point where the texting is starting to, cause emotional distress. And we think about this, like, I mean, I get annoyed about like phone calls and text messages and things like this, but we have like perpetrators who are using like robocall services where like you can't even use your phone because it's constantly texting you or calling you. And like, some people need their phones or their laptops and things for everyday work. And so that can kind of cause that distress. Or the two were different behaviors. So, he kept texting me, and now, he's driving around my apartment complex kind of thing. So that's that two or more behaviors. And this is where the statutes start to vary. So most statutes actually have what we call a reasonable fear standard. And so this is basically like, would these behaviors cause a reasonable person to feel fear for themselves or others? And so this is really important for us who are trying to support survivors of stalking, because sometimes the victims of stalking have been dealing with this nonsense for so long that like they just become kind of accustomed to like the annoying or horrifying behaviors, especially if it's an intimate partner stalker where there's a long history of abuse and control and things like that. Whereas like a reasonable person uses an objective standard where it's like a victim's telling us this stuff and it's like, I'm not really scared, but we're like listening to me like, he's breaking into your home and moving stuff around. Like, it may not be terrifying to you, but like that would make a reasonable person terrified for their safety. And so that can help prosecutors when they have, or law enforcement and prosecutors when they have victims who are like, I'm not really like scared, but like when we look at the totality of the circumstance, so everything that's been going on, like a reasonable person would be like, this is unacceptable and it is impacting the victim's lives. They're not terrified, but we can use this reasonable person standard to show that, this person is engaging in this pattern of behavior that is creating a nuisance not only to this person, but to the community as well. And it's exhausting our system resources. And so that's that reasonable fear standard. Most states actually have that reasonable fear standard. Where it gets kind of finicky is the statutes that actually require victims to feel fear. And that's where we have a lot of problems with that, because requiring victims to feel a certain way seems like a win for stalkers, because stalkers want their victims to be fearful. Not all of them, but depending on their motives and things like that. But we shouldn't have to require victims to get to a certain stage of terror in order to get access to justice. And this also creates a lot of issues, especially for male victims of stalking, because As a cis male, like we are socialized to be, masculinity is very important. And in combing through police reports, like you have these male victims who are experiencing pretty like alarming, behaviors, but like they're dealing with also like likely male police officers, and so they're trying to explain like how their ex-girlfriend is like trying to disrupt their life, and they feel like it's very emasculating talking to a police officer. And the officers are like, all right, do you feel scared? And they're like, well, I'm not like scared, but I'm like concerned about what she's going to do, kind of thing. And so if victims aren't necessarily saying that they are scared for their safety in these states, it can kind of limit their access to justice. And so really we encourage states to adopt that reasonable fear standard. So victims could either experience that substantial emotional distress, actual fear, or looking at everything going on, would a reasonable person consider these behaviors to be terrifying? And then also looking at it like, are these like, should the offender reasonably know that these behaviors would be a nuisance, kind of thing? And so understanding that reasonable, we see that a lot in our justice system in terms of what reasonable is. It's supposed to be objective, but really when we're looking at like everything that's been going on, would we look at this being like, this is unacceptable and this is alarming and things like that? And so when it reaches that threshold, that's when we're actually dealing with stalking. So the other thing on top of all of this is any of these can involve both criminal and legal behaviors. So what else really kind of makes stalking unique is that it actually criminalizes legal behaviors. And so you'll have, stalkers that'll be like, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting at the bus stop. And it just so happens to be outside of, her apartment complex. And in and of itself, it's not illegal to be at that bus stop, right? But when we have to look at, the context of the situation, it's like, does he normally ride the bus, or does he go to that? Does he live in this area? Does this serve a legitimate reason? Like, why are they at this bus stop now, kind of thing? And so stalking can actually criminalize like non-legal behaviors. So that's where you get to the text messaging, the showing up to places, things like that. And so sometimes officers and prosecutors are not used to that. And so they'll say like, well, that's creepy, but it's not necessarily criminal. And so we have to look at this kind of context of it. And just because it's not illegal doesn't mean that it's causing victims distress or fear for their safety.
What do you do in like cases where the victim doesn't realize they're a victim, where they're in the situation and they're like, it's fine, like this is how they are, but
yeah. I mean, we see this a lot, especially with victims of domestic violence and things like that, because the perpetrators have created a reality where their actions are normalized and something that the victim should just put up with, kind of thing. And so you have some victims that aren't necessarily recognizing these behaviors as concerning or even abusive because they've had like relationships like this before, things like that. And so in terms of like working with victims like that, like it's really not my job to tell victims like how they should feel or about that. It's really being a resource and understanding like, well, let's look at it from like this perspective. And so a lot of times we use like the power and control wheel. It's very common in like domestic violence cases where you have victims who are like, well, he doesn't hit me, kind of thing. And so we use this power and control wheel where generally on the outsides you have the rubber, which is like your physical and sexual violence. That definitely does happen, but it may not happen as often as we think. And really what offenders are doing are using all of these other emotional, psychological tactics to really instill kind of this insidious control over victims. And when we say control, it's this feeling of victims think twice before they do things. They have to think about like, is this going to piss this person off? Or, even if I just, take a walk to the gas station, like, is this person going to try to show up and take advantage of that kind of thing? So an activity that like I've used is like giving them the power and control wheel, and we kind of go through a bunch of different examples, and I have them like highlight things that have happened to them based off of this person. And really like in some of these cases, like victims are saying like, well, he doesn't necessarily hit me, but then the whole wheel is highlighted because they're doing all these other things. And it's really just trying to chip away at the victim's sense of empowerment and autonomy. And it is creating a world where victims feel like, I'm just going to comply with this person because it's easier.
Yeah, and through your research, what groups of people do you believe are most disproportionately affected by stalking?
We know from like national studies, which is also hard because it's very hard to tap into like marginalized populations. But for domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, predominantly Indigenous populations, and especially individuals that are mixed race, those are at the highest. Stalking is what we call a gender-based form of abuse, where it is predominantly perpetrated by males against females. And so we do see higher rates among women. But in terms of kind of the ranking of prevalence, in terms of who are kind of the perpetrators, most commonly we have male perpetrators and female victims. But the second comes in as female perpetrators of female victims, and followed by female perpetrators of male victims, and then the least common is male perpetrators of male victims. And what's interesting when we're talking about the gender dyads and stuff like that, when I look at the prevalence of those same-sex, I don't want to call them couples, but same-sex dyads, it's actually a very small percentage of them that are actually in intimate relationships. So the majority of same-sex stalkers are like family members, close acquaintances, neighbors that just happen to be the same sex as that person. They're not always motivated by romance or revenge, especially when it comes to family members. They're often motivated by like they feel rejected and they want to be included in the victim's life and stuff like that. And so they are going to show up at school, all that stuff to create a big issue and to do anything to kind of get the victim's attention. So definitely women and marginalized groups tend to be at the highest risk.
And what are some telltale signs that you're being stalked? And what are some signs that might not be so obvious right away?
So I just published a study because I was really interested in looking at like the next generation's like experiences with stalking. So like a lot of like the good data that we have been relying on for so long was collected back in 2006. And so that was really before the proliferation of like social media and really before the internet became so ingrained in our lives. And so luckily in 2016 and 2019, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they do a national survey, the National Crime Victimization Survey. They do that every year, but every other year they do like a supplemental survey. And so they've actually done it twice for stalking. So before we were able to kind of, so in these surveys, we never ask victims, we never say the term stalking because really people have different definitions of stalking. And this is generally why. Because generally when people think of stalking, they think first following behaviors, which why wouldn't they? Because it's like in the name. But two, also like we call it the social normalization of stalking, where that's like Facebook stalking, like I'm going to stalk them on the internet before we go on this date and stuff like that. So we kind of like normalize it, poke jokes at it. Like you can just Google like stalking images and like all of them are like those like e-cards where it's like, I'm on a second date. They just don't know about it. And so it's like, it makes it seem like it's kind of, a joke and things like that.
Right. And normalized, like you said.
Yeah. And so a lot of times like that puts our guard down where we just think like, oh, especially with younger populations, when they're starting to get into relationships, they think, oh, this behavior is like normal. And, if, what I've learned from romantic comedies, like unless they're like, disregarding TSA policies and flying across the United States to, show up at my door trying to fight for my love, then they don't really love me kind of thing. And like romantic comedies tend to gaslight romance, but that's a different story. So like really trying to understand what stalking is. And so the study that I just published is I really wanted to look at like Gen Z, like now that they are kind of like these digital natives, like what do they think stalking is? And I ran all these analysis and really what came up was they are falling into the same pattern as 20 years ago, and that the only behavior that they thought was stalking was the frequency in which someone was followed. And so I really wanted to get their perceptions on like kind of emerging technologies that perpetrators are using. So like doxing, spoofing, doppelstalking, like all of these interesting kind of buzz terms. None of them they recognize as stalking. So we basically ask them all these experiences, and at the very end of the survey, we ask them like, would you consider your experience to be stalking? And so about 60% of them did. They met the legal definition of stalking, but of those, what they thought was stalking was pretty much just the following behaviors. And so that creates, oh, and the other one was victims who were frequently threatened or harassed via Snapchat did not think that that was stalking. And so that really creates an interesting conundrum. And what's really important for the future of like prevention and awareness education is helping kind of society understand that like unhealthy behaviors can constitute stalking when they are perpetrated through technology. And so I think it's sometimes interesting that we kind of have this like weird technological divide where it's like if it's happening on the internet, it's not like a real thing, and so it's not until like they're harassing me on Facebook, but now they're actually like showing up in person, or I'm seeing them in real life, that, oh, this is what stalking is. And so really that creates a big issue, is because we just think that, so telltale signs is victims may be just looking for like them just showing up, or them being followed, and that's when they're like, oh, now I'm being stalked. When in reality, it's like if they ever start to experience some substantial, like you can experience distress, and there could be a ton of things that a reasonable person would consider to be fearful, like that is done through technology. And so my advice to victims is if they are starting to feel like someone is basically trying to infiltrate their personal professional lives in a way that is like annoying and unhealthy, understand that coincidences no longer exist. Like a lot of times we're thinking like, I've seen that guy before, and I last week I was at like Subway and I ran into him and it was just so weird, and now I'm seeing at the grocery store. Like, this is a weird coincidence. It's like, no, if you feel like someone is infiltrating on your life, like you want to pay attention to that and trust your gut. But really the crappy thing is like most people think that stalking is done by strangers who have mental health issues, who are obsessed with like celebrities. And that is actually like the least common type of stalker. The most common is going to be someone that we know. Like 76% of the stalking victims like know the perpetrator in some capacity. And so it's usually going to be either a close acquaintance, like a family member, friend, or ex-friend, or an intimate partner. And so that also creates an issue because, when we become friends or intimate partners with someone, like when we go on a first date, like if someone punched me in the face, like I'm not going to go out with them again, right? We created the scene at Chili's, like it was embarrassing, so I'm not, but that's not how stalkers are, right? They can be very friendly, and you start to develop these relationships, and that's what makes stalking very insidious, is that the people who are doing it know so much about our lives and our routines that they can really capitalize on the things that make us vulnerable. And so we just tend to think like it's someone who is not getting over what they said at Thanksgiving, or they're not getting over the relationship and things like that. And so they may not think of that as stalking, but once it really starts, someone else's behavior starts to stress us out, and it really starts to make us kind of concerned for our safety, like that's where we really need to trust our gut and understand like this behavior can potentially escalate if the offender doesn't feel like they're getting what they want. And I'm not saying that victims should cave and give the offender what they want, but like at that point is when things need to start being documented. Maybe not necessarily going to the police, but once you start to feel like your safety is in jeopardy, like that's when police should probably be involved. If not, to just report it to the police so that they have a record of kind of what's going on with that and things like that. So it's kind of hard. I would just say like offenders can be very manipulative. So the behaviors that we think are unhealthy, they're going to come. It's so fascinating when I look at these police reports and they actually go and talk to the stalker. Like they'll talk to the officer and they're like, this is a huge misunderstanding. Here's all the reasons why I was in those locations and things like that. And that's really important from an investigative standpoint, because they love to talk and they want to try to rationalize like what they're doing. And that is good because they usually slip up. But for these offenders, they're going to try to convince victims that like, oh, it's just a coincidence, or gaslight them into thinking that they're going crazy or that they're being overreactive or things like that. But really, we have to trust our gut and understanding like, this person may not be trying to do this maliciously, but that is not an element that needs to be proved from a legal standpoint. It doesn't have to be done with like malicious intent unless there's a specific aspect of a statute that says it. We use this reasonable person standard, being like, it doesn't matter if this person isn't trying to create fear in the victim. They are engaging in a pattern behavior that they should, one, reasonably know is intrusive, and or it would cause a reasonable person to be fearful or substantially distressed. And so because offenders can kind of be very manipulative, sometimes we are in too deep before we realize, like, I think this is like stalking.
That's so cool that you talk about your gut, because I always say that that is your most powerful tool that you don't even realize that you have.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yes, and I mean, we tell this with officers too. It's like, trust your gut, because that is a sense of intuition, and really, like, trusting our gut is really just a survival tactic. It's really our amygdala and our brain sending messages to, like, our body being like, hey, something's weird here. I don't know, but something, like, we gotta either look into this or protect ourselves because something's about to happen, kind of thing. So definitely, like, encourage victims to trust their gut, um, and understand that, like, if they feel like something is going on, even if it's just like a harassment situation, like, documentation, trust your gut, and that coincidences no longer exist, because there's likely a pattern that is happening, and in order to do something about it, that needs to be documented or taking precautions for themselves.
Yeah. And sort of, you kind of touched upon this, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, do we know what like the offender's motives are typically when it comes to like why they stalk people or the
Yeah,
victim?
so that's asked in the National Crime Victimization Survey, and so really, like, really one of the biggest limitations that we have is research on, like, with stalkers, like interviewing people who have either been arrested or convicted of stalking, and so a lot of the information that we have is from the victim's standpoint, and so we can be somewhat confident in this because generally most victims are stalked by someone that they know, so they may have some inkling in terms of what the motive is. But what's really interesting is, like, I always thought kind of like the motives would differ depending on who the person was that was stalking them, like, especially for, like, maybe professional acquaintances or even strangers. Like, I just assumed that they all wanted, like, to be in a relationship with that person, and that is not always the case. And so generally victims are given a whole list of, like, motives, and they're asked, like, what motives do you think that these offenders are, or why do you think that these perpetrators were doing this, and the top three are going to be, like, entitlement or arrogance. They just feel entitled to getting the information that they want from the victim, and they're going to do anything to get that victim's attention. Power and control. So they feel like, this victim doesn't want to be their friend anymore, doesn't want to be in a relationship, or doesn't want anything to do with them. And so they want to have control over that situation. And so they're going to do anything and everything to kind of get victims to comply with their demands. And then the final is, like, rejection. So they feel rejected, and that kind of pairs a lot with that power and control. And this is where it gets really kind of dangerous, especially in intimate partner situations, because we have something called the dangerous assessment, and this has been around since I think, like, the 90s. But now, like, a lot of times when officers are responding to domestic violence calls, depending on the agency, a lot of agencies now, like, mandate it. They have to fill out these dangerous assessments, and so it gives officers kind of like an idea of, like, if they score 7 and above, like, this is something that needs, like, an immediate follow-up. Generally, if they're scoring higher, they're experiencing stalking, forced sexual assault, strangulation. But one of the key characteristics of that is power and control and jealousy issues. And so when we get that idea of sense of rejection, that's where we really get to that, those offenders who are saying, like, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. And that's not only creating a situation where this could potentially turn into a homicide, but that also poses a risk to everyone around that victim as well. Because we definitely do have offenders that are like, well, if I can't have you, I'm going to go for, what you care about the most. And that's friends and family members and things like that. So yeah, so those are the top 3 motives, and those are consistent across all types of stalkers. So they just feel entitled to, destroying this person's life, or to be persistent in their pursuits. And then they want power and control over. They want to be able to control what this victim does and thinks. And then they also just feel, like, rejected, and so they get a sense of jealousy, and so they just almost become kind of obsessed with this person. And so that can kind of go back to the idea where they may not be intending to create fear in the victim, but it doesn't matter, like, what I feel like this person's intending to do. If it's making me feel terrified, like now it's starting to violate my, my personal boundaries and my personal autonomy, because now I feel like I can't, just go out to go grocery shopping or things like that, because I don't know if this person's going to show up, or if they're going to know where I am, or they're going to create some type of scene kind of thing. And so really, I always kind of just describe it as like, these are perpetrators who just are not very good at coping with being told no. And they feel some type of semblance in terms of, some of these cases, like the perpetrator is like obsessed with this target and like wants the victim to specifically tell them no, like, and that they don't want a relationship. And that's not what offenders get. That's not something that is justified, right? And so a lot of times offenders are going to try to come up with all these different reasons as to why they're doing it. Well, I also go back to this. So there's a couple studies that have done research with victims of intimate partner violence, where the perpetrator has been convicted, but and they interviewed the victim and they interviewed the perpetrator separately, and they really wanted to kind of like figure out like what was the incident that led up to like this arrest and stuff. And it was so fascinating. The women in the study were all very consistent. It's like they are just entitled. They want this power and control. It's like whenever I'm just trying to be assertive, like, no, I don't want to do this, like that's when he hits me. And then when you were talking to the men, they don't mention the word control at all. They don't understand power and control. And I think that goes back to a lot with like male privilege and things like that. And it's also hard, as we explain it to police officers as well, because a lot of police officers are straight white men. And, shout out to straight white men, but like literally when we look at the stats on police officers, it's like 75% basically men. Women only constitute about 12% of that. And so I use the analogy of like, if you've never been in this situation where you have to be like, women think differently in terms of like when they go grocery shopping or when they go to the movies. Like, I'm a criminologist, so like I've definitely carried my keys in my hands just because of like, you never know.
That's something we were taught like in high school. It's like, you got to be careful going to the parking deck in college, like be careful, watch your back, hold your keys in your hand.
Yes. And that is not something that like men get that socialization, right? And so when you've never really kind of been in a position where someone can kind of take advantage of you, it can be hard to empathize with what victims are experiencing. And so, and same thing for male perpetrators as well, where like they've just always kind of like everything's been given to them, like they've never really been told no. And so now that like there's a woman, especially like a woman of color telling them no, then, that just sets them off and they feel some weird way of like trying to correct that kind of thing. And so I think that goes back to like prevention and education and really, helping us understand that like privilege is a real thing and that it exists, and that the ways that society is being socialized in terms of gender, it has implications for safety.
Like, as you mentioned, like this is such a contentious subject. What is the criminal justice responses to cases like this? Is it like, should they be better? What are their typical responses? How are these perpetrators like prosecuted and whatnot?
Yeah, not well. It's not good. And I always like to say it's like where we are with stalking now is where we were with domestic violence in like the 70s. Like we're starting to get understanding like, oh, we need to be looking into this. Like that's why we have a lot of federal legislation now that includes stalking in it, but like stalking is always kind of thought of as an afterthought. And so that creates an issue. So now we have a bunch of like resources going into communities to really help, police departments, victim service agencies, and even like prosecuting agencies, like to improve their responses to, stalking and domestic violence. But it really goes back to kind of training. So something that I thought was fascinating is that in our criminal justice system, we have prosecutors, and that is honestly the most powerful position in the justice system. Yes, judges can determine what comes into court, things like that, but they generally have oversight in the appellate court. So like if they make a mistake, then their decision can be overturned. But with prosecutors, they don't really have oversight. They are the ones that have the end all be all. And what I found fascinating is that so many prosecutors have never had like a DV 101. So some of the prosecutors that I've talked to said like when they got a job, they became a baby DA, and their job was to screen all the cases. And so they're dealing with like felony, misdemeanor level domestic violence, and they don't understand, power and control dynamics, anything like that. They're just looking for specific, things related to the laws. And so they have a very kind of minimal understanding of what this is. And then research on officers, it's like, it's the same thing. Whenever I ask officers, like, what are your stalking cases like? They always tell me of like a stranger situation, someone that has mental health or substance abuse issues, who are like literally hiding in bushes. Like that is what they generally assume with it. And so my experience is like, it's not that our justice system doesn't care about stalking. I haven't come across that. But I've also come across cases where it's like, it's not necessarily like a priority for agencies. I mean, our justice system has also been socialized to be so focused on drugs and violent crime and stuff like that, that when it comes to crimes against women, it's like more symbolic versus like substantive. And so they say that they're doing it for the victims, but when we actually like look at some of the research, it's like they're traumatizing victims because they don't believe them, all this stuff like that. But again, I want, like, my experience is most officers are, and prosecutors, like, really do care about this and really do care about keeping victims safe. And the thing that really gets frustrating to them is their inability to do something about it, because there is either just like not enough evidence, or there's something that they don't think like a prosecutor is going to or something that a prosecutor's like not going to like and probably not file charges, because prosecutors are thinking like, what is the jury going to think of this? Like we had a case where it was the victim was absolutely terrified of her husband. They were separated for like a year, and she got into a relationship with someone else. And the prosecutor in the case file wrote like, yeah, this is a pretty alarming case, but I have concerns about victim credibility, and that the jury is not going to like that she is still married and has a boyfriend, which is like,
That's insane.
and not a reason to like dismiss a criminal case, right? Like that is something you can't explain to a jury, like the dynamics of that and how it's been like an entire year that this person is still terrorizing not only the victim's new boyfriend, or not only the victim, but the victim's new boyfriend now. So it's stuff like that where prosecutors are thinking like, can I convince a jury like of this? And if you are living in more kind of like rural areas, you're going to have a lot more like conservative juries who are really focused on, who also don't have a lot of training in like trauma and victimization. And so when we don't have that information, we kind of just fill our perceptions with stereotypes. And so you have like juries who are so focused on what the victim was doing and completely ignore like the offender is the one that's on trial here, but really like in some of these cases, the victim is the only witness to these behaviors. And so because of our Sixth Amendment right to confrontation, like they have to testify, they have to go under oath. And if defense attorneys don't have anything to criticize the evidence collection or how the case was investigated, or point to someone else that was doing it, the third tactic is to destroy the credibility of the victim and convince juries or judges that you can't believe this person because of A, B, and C kind of thing. So I'm very optimistic. We now have resources in place like the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. Like their calendar is booked going around all the United States, training communities, advocates, prosecutors, law enforcement about this crime. And so this is, and doing things like this as well, I think is helpful, because really the issue that we have is just knowing what stalking is and being able to identify it. And then even then, some officers are like, those cases are too much work for a misdemeanor, right? And then states are like, okay, well, we'll make it a felony. But then prosecutors are like, well, that's just even a higher bar, like to prove a felony. And so generally, like prosecutors need something. So generally, when people are charged with felony stalking, it's because they like violated a protection order. They have already been trespassed from the property. There's a no contact order like in place. Or they have a prior conviction for stalking. And so if they get arrested again, it's an automatic, felony kind of thing. So that's the arrest part. And then officers are like, we're a small department. Most police departments in the United States are small, so they don't have the investigative resources to do surveillance in these neighborhoods to see if they're driving by and stuff. And so unfortunately, victims have to be pretty much their own crime scene investigator in these cases. And then when it gets to prosecutors, we're talking to them and they're saying like, oh, I have no problem charging stalking. But the reason why like they do it is because it's they use it for plea bargaining. So it'll be stalking as a felony. And what's interesting is offenders do not like stalking on their record. I mean, nobody does. Well, they shouldn't be doing stalking to get that. But like nobody wants to be called like a stalker, right? So that is a very jarring kind of label that can go on their record. And so what prosecutors will do is they do this in the sense that most stalking laws don't really have teeth. They, if anything, like they may go to prison for like 2 years, if that. Um, so there's not really any like that doesn't give victims like any semblance of safety because 2 years later, like they're going to be out.
They're out.
So what prosecutors will do is like, okay, well, especially in domestic violence situations, because DV laws tend to have a lot more teeth, or you can do with it. So what they'll do is they'll say, hey, so we have all this evidence and we're going to charge you with stalking, but if you plead to misdemeanor disturbing the peace domestic violence, we'll drop the stalking charge and you can just plead to that. And in their mind, knowing that like, oh, if they get so many misdemeanors, then it automatically becomes a felony, and then and generally with some teeth, so like a minimum 10 years kind of thing. And so they call them predicated offenses. So they'll use stalking, but for leverage and drop that. And that's an issue because one, we had a case where the victim was like, no, I don't want disturbing the peace. I want stalking because that's what he was doing. And I want other women to know that this is a dangerous person and that it needs to be on their record. And so the prosecutor was saying like, it's so much easier to prove disturbing the peace. And when I look at the statutes, it makes a lot more sense. Stalking can be very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Disturbing the peace is basically like any nuisance offense. And then if it's an intimate partner or family member, it can be charged with DV and stuff. And so prosecutors are not always fully understanding the benefits of charging stalking. And that gets into a much more legal kind of conversation. Like a lot of prosecutors are like, oh, well, there's not enough evidence. And then even if we do have evidence, like we have to convince a judge to bring all this evidence in. And especially now that like stalking is becoming much more digital, you have a lot of judges and prosecutors who are not really tech savvy or have the digital literacy to like fully understand. Like, so if we get a text message, like the next step is to authenticate that it was this person that sent that text message. There's ways to do about all that stuff like that. But with stalking, like a lot of times you have like hearsay issues, all that stuff. But if you were charging stalking, you were trying to prove a pattern of behavior that has caused fear. And so anything and everything that perpetrator has been doing now gets to get admitted into evidence because prosecutors have to prove that pattern of behavior. But officers and prosecutors are very busy. They have a ton of cases. And so really their mindset focuses on solvability factors. And so if the evidence is just not there, or, it's going to be something where it's like, this case is going to take a lot of time and resources. It's not because they don't want to investigate it. It's because they do not have that ability to do that. And so now we're seeing a lot more stalking victims being like, I already have 4 binders for you. So here's all the evidence, things like that. And so the system is getting better, but I think that also talks about, or I think we also need to have better conversations about what is justice to victims.
Yeah, when you were talking about how like a lot of these people aren't tech savvy, and you also brought up how a lot of these like Gen Z kids like say they're getting stalked on Snapchat when these messages disappear. Like, how do you kind of show this to like a prosecutor or someone to be like, this is a real thing, except it's a new technology, right?
And how do you document that safely? Because on Snapchat, whenever you like screenshot a message, they get it. Yeah. And so and I understand like that was, I think initially designed for like nudes and things like that. But yeah. And so that's something that, and it's interesting when we look at like, well, who are your cybercrime guys in your police department? And it's like, oh, Al, he used to work at Radio Shack. They're going to these like 40-hour trainings. And so you don't have like some of the bigger agencies, FBI, like they're hiring engineers and things like that fully like IT people, all this stuff. But like sometimes it's like rock, paper, scissors. We'll send, Anthony to like the training in Florida. He'll come back and he's going to be our cybercrime person. Now that we're having a lot more issues with like child exploitation, revenge porn, stuff like that, they're putting a lot more resources in there. But like, how are we training officers? We're not even training, future prosecutors about domestic violence. And we train officers about domestic violence, but how much stalking and strangulation and all these other kind of coercive controlling behaviors are included in that training is likely going to be like 1 or 2 slides kind of thing. And so again, when you don't have all the information in these crimes, you start to fill in the blanks, because that's how we want, like that's how our brain works. We want to have a narrative of what we think is happening, and we fill in the blanks, even if those blanks come with stereotypes and credibility issues, all that stuff like that. So it's getting better, but going back to the people that we're training to intervene in these situations, we still have a lot of work. And so now we need a lot more conversations. And there are some really cool, like there's Cornell Tech has a whole digital cyber abuse lab where they're actually interviewing victims. Like they're like, tell me like why, like, so it would be like victims that have like spyware on their phone. And so instead of being like, they're like, tell me how you describe that to, you know, the Genius bars or to the police officers. And so they're trying to identify themes and like how victims are describing it versus like, because victims aren't, unless they fully understand what it is, like they're not going to be like, I'm being spoofed, you know, this person's doxing this information, you know, they are using a robocall kind of thing. A lot of times victims are going to be like, I don't know, he seems to know things that he shouldn't know, or you know, he's showing up to places that like I have no idea how he knows I would be there, kind of thing. Like I think something's on my phone. And so we just need to do a lot better job of like tapping into IT experts to help us explain, be able to kind of understand how we can do some preliminary like evidence collection while keeping victims safe, and being able to convince officers, like especially first responders who are really just kind of taking, you know, the initial report, and then if it's serious enough, it may open an investigation. But how can we train officers from that initial interaction to kind of streamline some of that, provide the victim not only with resources to help them with like victim service agencies, victim compensation, but how to collect this evidence in a way that's going to be safe for them, that they can actually get admitted into court. And when you ask officers that now, like really it's going to be some of the seasoned officers who have been doing, you know, cybercrime cases. But other than that, it's like relatively new. Our criminal justice system is very antiquated, and so is our training on cybercrime, you know, for police officers. And so it's something that I'm fascinated with, is basically that initial response. How can we improve that, so one, it leads to an investigation, and also feels like it was worth the victim's time and energy to get officers involved. And so, but to do that, we have to have, you know, officers that have that capacity to even help.
And can you kind of go through what the framework of the training is? I know you've touched upon it, but it's like in this day and age, what does that training entail?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do, well, so a lot of the training is focused on like how do we identify stalking, and so a lot of me and my colleagues will use what we call the SLI framework, SLII, and so this is basically, it stands for surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference. And so this really is a framework that helps officers ask questions about things that victims may not be picking up on. Because what we've learned is like the reason why victims call police is because they are fearful, and the perpetrators engaging in behaviors that are escalating. So not only are they engaging in stalking, they're also like destroying property, making threats, assaulting them, physically approaching them. And so victims start to get scared for their safety. And so generally what they're going to report to the police is like, my tires have been slashed, right? And so officers show up and they're like, okay, but like I can't control what happened 2 weeks ago. Why am I here today? I see the tires are slashed. Okay, I'm going to take a report. And then it might, depending on the size of the agency, if they have specialized detectives, some agencies have one detective, they investigate all crimes, but it may go to a property crime detective. And so like, how are we like tracking this to make sure that there's follow-up, and how are we connecting this to other cases? Because, you know, a tire slashing, yeah, sometimes that could seem like something out of the blue, but likely someone was angry enough or you know, motivated to slash someone's tires. And so we need to start investigating, you know, kind of what's going on behind that. So the SLI framework really helps officers kind of ask more questions to help identify other behaviors that we can use for that pattern of behavior that needs to be there for stalking. So surveillance behaviors are going to be anything from physical to digital surveillance. So that's where we're going to have the following, the watching, showing up in places unexpectedly or where they don't have any legitimate reason to be. But then it's also going to involve your spyware. So spyware is something that can get installed on devices, and it is alarming because it is designed to be spyware, to spy on the devices. So if the victim has spyware on their computer or their phone, it basically is sending this stuff to the cloud where the perpetrator can log in. And some of these apps are relatively inexpensive, like less than $10. And it set up like an iTunes library where it's like, if you want to see their text message, you can see who they're texting, what they're posting on social media, what they're talking about in their DMs, their emails, their passwords, anything that's on their device, like you have access to. And so whenever we hear victims saying like, I don't know how they know the things that they know, like that is where we need to start asking about potentially like surveillance, things like that. And then life invasion is that just disruption of that personal and professional quality of life where they are either harassing friends and family, they are creating issues for you at work, they are constantly blowing up your phones, constantly creating fake social media accounts to harass you, things like that. Then you have the intimidation, and intimidation is going to be, it's much more subjective, so it's going to be like how the victim feels, but this could also be like the watching behaviors. And so none of these are mutually exclusive. It's just a framework to help kind of, okay, so think of things that could be intimidating. Like, have they ever, showed up to your work and sat in the parking lot waiting for you when you're coming out? Have they destroyed property to terrify you? Have they, left a dead bird on your porch with like a poem? Like all these different things, trying to get them to think of different ways that the perpetrator has acted that may have kind of intimidated the victim. And then the last category is basically interference. So that's going to be basically physical sexual attacks or personal professional sabotage. So they are, engaging in non-consensual pornography. They are, mailing, explicit photos to friends, family members, anything to embarrass you. They will lock you out of social media accounts and then pretend to be you and say that racist things that can get you fired, all this stuff. And so we use the SLY framework really to help victims think about all the different ways that perpetrators are basically making their lives miserable, so that they can document that and help try to find some evidence to corroborate that. And it's the same thing for officers as well. So going back to the idea of like what victims are reporting to the police generally are the most serious things that have led them to actually call the police. Most victims have done a lot of work to try to avoid involving the police. They just didn't think it was serious enough. And so when they are calling the police, like it's not for fun, and officers need to understand that, is when they're calling the police, like it has now interfered with their life in a way that it is hard for them to kind of go about their everyday activities, and they are scared for their safety. And we have a bunch of research to show that that is why they call the police. And so they may be describing something that doesn't seem like a pattern of behavior, but that's where officers really need to step. We shouldn't, require victims to be experts in the law. That's not their job. And, officers need to know the law, but just because we have laws doesn't mean that they are using them correctly. To no fault of their own. Again, we have so many different laws. There's a ton of different issues. Not every officer is going to be an expert in domestic violence, stalking, drugs, all that stuff. It's part of their kind of everyday routine. So we really need these frontline officers to help victims and ask questions in ways that they can actually corroborate some of these legal elements to see if a stalking case is there. And that's not always the goal of, we understand that like arrest and prosecution doesn't always fix everything for everyone. And really, like when I have a study that shows that calling the police, victims who called the police actually had better odds of deterring a stalker than victims who didn't. And so again, calling the police is not a resource for everyone. But what I argued in that is something that we call conditional deterrence. And that's the idea that like most people don't want officers involved in their life, and they may be so caught up and so obsessed with like trying to get this victim's attention or trying to get them into a relationship, stuff like that, that once cops show up, like it's kind of like a reality, like, oh snap, okay. And all officers need to do is just contact the person and be like, yo, this person doesn't want you contacting them anymore, and so I'm officially telling you to leave them alone. And so if I have any more issues with this, I'm going to start charging you for stalking or harassment, stuff like that. So it's saying like, if you continue to bother this person, we get more calls, like I'm going to up the ante. And that generally seems to work. There's a couple other studies that show that like, if they talk to the perpetrator and warn them, generally that definitely helped the victim. But again, not all victims want to call the police. They don't want to get them involved. And especially like, because most stalkers are someone that the victim knows. So it's like, how can you call, the police on your boss, on a family member? You don't want to create, like, some victims are like, I didn't call the police because it would be, I don't like this term, but like social suicide. Like then everyone's going to think like I'm dramatic and I'm creating a big deal. And then you have the perpetrator over here who doesn't want to be called stalker, who is absolutely being a stalker, is saying like, no, she's crazy, she's making up all this stuff and she's bullying this way out of proportion and stuff. And then everyone just seems like, I can't believe Becky called the police. Like, that is crazy. Like, Kevin's just trying to work here. So there's a lot of issues that go with it. And then to finish with that comment, so I paid attention to that when I was combing through these police reports. And so in one of the studies, we have 4 years of stalking cases reported to the police. And so I paid attention like to how many of these cases the victim was like, oh, here's everything that's been going on. Here is a list of witnesses and contact information that you can go talk to them because they can confirm like, I'm not crazy and that this is actually happening. And then also generally they know who's doing it. So they give them the name and like where they can find them and stuff. So out of the 150 cases over the 4 years, oh, actually I have it right here. This is crazy. So there were 100 cases where the victim was able to be like, this is who's doing it. And 37% of those, the officers didn't even contact the perpetrator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's crazy to me. So like when we did this evaluation, like one of my main findings was like, I said it in like a nice way, but really it was like, oh, if you guys just do what you're supposed to do, you wouldn't have to have these cases. Like you can nip this in the bud real easily, but like, and they said it's like, this particular agency is like, we have communication issues between our frontline and our investigators and stuff like that. It's really just a report that gets sent and then the investigator can look into it if they have the time and their solvability factors in there and stuff. But like I'm coming through this case files and like I'm like feel like I'm reading like a horror novel and then it just ends. Like there's no supplemental reports, like they don't follow up on any of the witnesses or any of the suspects, and they basically are just kind of like, okay, I'm going to take a report, let me know if anything else happens. And that drives me nuts because I have all this research that shows like things have been happening and that's why they're calling you. And so it's like they're calling you for a reason. And so it needs to be looked into and treated as stalking until the evidence suggests otherwise. But then it goes back to time and resources and things like that. But like, it's basic investigative 101. Like if you are investigating a complaint of a felony level offense, stalking is generally a felony in most states, like that needs to be investigated. And especially the victim is like, here's a witness that can corroborate what's happening, and here's also the person that's doing it, go talk to them, even if it's just like a phone call kind of thing. Like that warning actually gives officers more teeth so that the next time something happens, they can actually do something because they've talked to that perpetrator and they warned them that what was going to happen if they continue to do this, and now they actually have more teeth and being able to make an arrest for telephone communication harassment or stalking or things like that. We're not always trying to get officers to make an arrest for stalking. Sometimes it is easier to arrest them for harassment or property destruction or something like that. But it's really the prosecutors that really need to be able to kind of tie everything into this bigger picture and understand that like stalking laws can actually help you be able to bring all this evidence into court and show a judge that like, it's not just an isolated incident. Like this is a pattern of behavior. Our victim is terrified. Now we are here and we need to hold this perpetrator accountable.
Yeah. I know we only have a few minutes left, but
oh my gosh,
it's okay. I can keep going.
Yeah.
Because I'm so fascinated.
Every time I talk to a reporter, they'll be like, can you tell me about stalking in the criminal justice system? And then 2 hours later, they're like, I have to go pick up my kid from school. And I was like, I'm sorry. I was like, I could talk about this.
Which is what I feel like. I'm like, we should have like another just like off the record conversation because I would love to learn more. But do you have any advice for people who like on how to prevent stalking? Just some like early action steps. I know there's some websites that kind of delete your digital footprint. You also talked about like kind of keep collecting your evidence. What advice do you have?
Yeah. So that's what sucks too about prevention is because a lot of the prevention goes, it kind of resembles like that, the sexual assault prevention where it's like women don't walk alone at night. Basically like women limit everything about your lives, to cater, to your safety so men don't attack you. It doesn't make any sense. So one, just real quick, is early prevention education. Like we need to be in high schools and middle schools talking about healthy relationships. Not necessarily, I mean, yes, we need to be talking about romantic relationships. But I used to do a bunch of like teen dating violence prevention work, and that's key. And I even do it in my college classes now. I have a whole section on healthy relationships. And even them in college, like I have on my reviews that are saying like, I'm glad we actually did this because, you know, there were certain things that like I thought was normal, but everyone else was like, no, this is so unhealthy. And so like, we need more education about healthy relationships. We need better ways of helping people cope with jealousy and self-esteem, things like that. And then in terms of prevention, just be very careful about personal information. Like, for example, like Walgreens is like, whenever you go to pick up your medication, they're like, can you confirm your phone number? And then are you still at 114, whatever? And like, everyone can hear it. And so like, I, every time I go to Walgreens to get my meds, I always tell them, I was like, hey, just so you know, like, I heard everything, all that personal information from these clients ahead of me. And so like, you know, being careful how you share your information. Like I tend to like, will write down my phone number or like whatever they need on a piece of paper and just show them. It seems weird and stuff like that, but like, I'm trying to look out for myself, right?
Better
So just be
safe than,
careful.
yeah.
Yeah. Other things is to set a Google alert for your name. You just never know when a website is going to pop up about you that the stalker has created and things like that. And then lastly, cops are always going to ask this, like, well, did you tell them to stop? And so sometimes that is not safe, but if victims can make it clear in a safe way that everything that is happening to them is unwanted, to do that and to not delete anything. As much as the, you know, unsolicited penis pictures are alarming, that is great evidence. So and harassing text messages, things like that, like these are the things that officers need to help corroborate these stories. So yeah, and a lot more work in that area needs to be done on prevention, because again, stalking tends to be kind of like this afterthought.
Yeah, clearly, like just by this hour-long conversation, it clearly should be at the forefront. People need to be more aware of it and stuff like that, because I feel like that show You, it kind of romanticizes it, which is, and it's scary.
Yeah, that goes back to that social normalization, because we even have people on Twitter posting like, oh, I wish she would stalk me. And like, I don't know if his real name is like Penn Badgley. I just know I don't know if that's his character, but he went on there being like, no, you don't. Like, stalking is a serious thing. Like the fact that he had to come out being like, just, you know, that's what the media needs to do, is stop casting like hot people as evil. Like, because people, that same thing with Ted Bundy and stuff like that. They're like, oh, Zac Efron is so handsome. And it's like, no, these are terrible people. Like, yeah. But you did bring some interesting aspects, because it did kind of highlight a lot of the ways that technology is being used and how our information can get exploited and stuff like that. But at the same time, it still tends to romanticize these behaviors.
It's insane.
Yeah, lots more work.
I don't know, Lauren, should I bring it back to you? I see you're adding things in the comments section where people can go to find more resources, where they can share their story and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, if you go to our website, stopstalkingus.com, we have compiled resources from a lot of different partners. You know, it's a very complex thing. There's usually not sort of like one simple solution, but it can be a place to start, and just some best practices. And yeah, and for those who want to share their story with us safely and anonymously, you can do that as well, or email us at contact@stopstalkingus.com. But thank you both so much for this. It's just such a pleasure, Patrick, to hear all of this. I mean, pleasure is probably the wrong word. It's horrifying, but to have the experience of so many people be backed up by doctor, researcher, science data, is just so impactful and really important to this movement. And yeah, Jasmine, thank you so much for taking us through all of that. I think you had the experience that everybody probably has when talking to Patrick, of just like mic drops and like, you know.
Yeah, and I think like I think it's really cool to note that you said it in such an engaging way. It wasn't just like stats and like hard facts and stuff like that. You explained it in a way that like anyone could understand, which I think
I train
awesome.
I train a lot of cops, and so they already hate that I'm there because I don't have a badge and a gun, and they also don't want to hear a bunch of that stuff. And I don't either. It's like, I'd rather like that's my whole craft, is trying to figure out how can I get students interested in something that they may not think is relevant to them or something like that, when a lot of what we were talking about is relevant, because you just never know. You never know if the person that you are friends with or in a relationship with like could become so jealous that they start to, engage in stalking kind of thing. And so, and when you're in the thick of it, you don't always know what to do. And so that's why I'm really appreciative of events like this and being able to connect with people that are also passionate about it, because like this is a big issue. It is a risk factor for homicide, and we need to start treating these as homicides in slow motion, homicides that are like just bound to happen. So early intervention is key. Trust your gut. Coincidences no longer exist, and technology will be the death of us. But I love Now This News. I do. I really do love. I really do. Not that it's now this news's fault, but I just randomly thought about that. But I do love Now This News.
That's awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. And yeah, this was the first in our series of panels we're doing every Thursday this month at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. So we hope that everyone's able to join us for our future events. And thank you both so much.
Thank
you so much. This was awesome.